We start.
A very pleasant morning to one and all over here. Uh, I welcome you all to this 3-day webinar on English Poetry, our educator. So before we begin, I would just like to tell you a few important things. First thing, you can, if you have any queries or if you have any questions, you can just drop in your questions or queries in the live chat over here. Secondly, we welcome you all to this 3-day webinar, and the feedback link will be given on the third day, that is the last day of the webinar. So I would like to also welcome our resource person, Professor Dr. John Silvai, HOD, Department of English. So over to you, sir.
Good morning to one and all, and warm welcome to this webinar 3 days program. You know well that we are treading into the territory of English literature, particularly the domain of poetry. Poetry always concentrates not only on the head, but on the heart. Therefore, my dear friends, I would very much appreciate if all of you extend to me a very comprehensive, empathic, and proactive listening. The reason is very obvious. You must have heard of an incident in the life of George Orwell. A young man, he happened to be an industrial chemist, and he approached him asking, I can't see anything in the use of poetry. Just like him, there are so many people who are icily and stonily indifferent to the study of poetry. Little do they realize that poetry can give them true education. All of us know Matthew Arnold, the greatest educator. He speaks in his critical essay on the study of poetry about the touchstone method. We have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, and to sustain us. He says further, without poetry, science will remain incomplete, and much that passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. Therefore, poetry can definitely give us true education. And I would like to invite you all to draw and derive immense consolation and stay in our life and bring it to the dregs, and then travel along with me into the realms of gold, which was used so elegantly by the edible poet John Keats. The study of English literature occupies an undisputed place of honor, is proved by its inclusion in the educational program of many countries. Why? Because of the universality of its appeal to man as man, the common ground or human experience on which it reveals and teaches. All these make English literature the greatest educator of mankind. If English literature in general has such a hold on the minds of millions, the secret of its success lies undoubtedly in the literary genre or form of poetry. In the history of every people, poetry has appeared long before prose. This is a good sign that poetry must be more educative than prose, because poetry goes deeper down into human nature and therefore likely to strike a resonant chord in the human heart. Let us first take the step in the education of poetry. The study of poetry gives a perception of the difference between poetry and prose. Before you step into the territory of poetry, we have to make it very clear the difference between prose and poetry. Carlyle perceives poetry as musical thought. Shelley views it as the best and happiest thoughts of the happiest and best minds. And Watts Dunton defines it as the concrete and artistic expression of the human mind in emotional and rhythmical language. These are, of course, beautiful intuitions into the nature of poetry, but they are too obscure for a beginner to understand. We should begin by understanding the obvious external or peripheral difference between prose and poetry. I will just give an example to distinguish poetry and prose from the greatest master and teacher of all. Just listen to this. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Similarly, in another occasion, he says, in the world you will have trouble, but be brave. I have conquered the world. This is a simple conversational piece, which is the hallmark of prose. All of you who are interested in literature must have heard of the famous prose essay writer Arthur Guttenbrook. In his essay on the defects of English prose, he mentions about a particular great author in English, Pearsall Smith. According to him, prose becomes greatest if it is nearest to poetry. And many writers in English, they confused poetry with prose. You should never, as Arthur Guttenbrook says, use poetry in prose. The cardinal virtue of poetry is love, and the cardinal virtue of prose is justice. Many writers, they just want to express in a poetic language in prose. It should never be. It should be always conversational. That is prose. Prose should not have any bombastic, pedantic, jaw-breaking, sounding, high-sounding expressions. That is not proper for prose. And he refers to the great French writer Pascal, who wrote provincial letters from the remote places in the year 1656, wherein he says in French, prose must be lucid, polite, conversational, based on justice. When we discuss, we should not come to blows and invective. It should be lucid and clear. That is the real characteristic of prose. But when you speak of poetry, it is based on love. And when there is love, no, you begin to act at the spur of the moment and come out with the loving, fluorescent expressions, and should never come closer to prose. And what makes beautiful and charming to poetry as different from prose is the rhyme, the meter, and alliterations, assonance. These are the most important qualities that distinguish poetry from prose. I will read a beautiful passage from Shelley's To a Skylark. We look before and after and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell us of saddest thought. You see, this is so different from the conversational, simple, and lucid expressions made by Lord Jesus Christ in the Bible, which I quoted earlier. So, what is important to make poetry distinct from prose is the meter, the rhyming words, the rhythm. That should make it as the distinguishing quality of poetry. It is because of meter, the poetry becomes, as I said earlier, the riding brother, as a different from the walking brother of prose. But my question is, does meter alone make a real poetry? How to perceive beyond the garb and dress of poetry, the soul of poetry, without which meter is just a tingling symbol? I will give an example. Suppose a man says like this: a man climbed a tree and was stung by a bee. Being asked, "Does it buzz?" he answered, "So it does." You see the meter in this stanza. A man climbed a tree and was stung by a bee. Being asked, "Does it buzz?" he answered, "So it does." It's okay for making the children happy. It's full of rhymes. Or a young man meeting his girlfriend speaks to her, "Oh dear, come near. Why fear? I am here. Bring a bottle of beer. I will break it for cheer." Suppose he speaks like that in metrical form. Does it make a real poetry? These two examples have rhymes, rhythm, meter, melody, but they are devoid of the soul of poetry. There is no essence of poetry over there. They don't emotionally appeal to your head. A man climbed a tree and was stung by a bee. Are you emotionally charged by that? No. They are just what you call rhyming words, that's all. But look at this passage from William Wordsworth's Lucy poems. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. But she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. In the last example from William Wordsworth, besides the rhyming words, you have something to appeal to you, the anguish and agony over the loss of Lucy. We perceive in this altogether something which is so stirring our heart, and therefore it makes a real poetry besides the genre or form or the structure or the figure that distinguishes poetry from prose, because it appeals to our head and heart. Again, friends, it is not the definition of poetry, however, that our education through poetry consists. It is not just knowing the difference from poetry and prose that makes us aware of the educative power of poetry either. The study of poetry educates us in proportion to the awareness it creates among us, the beauty of which it is the revelation. And the first revelation or beauty which poetry produces is the consciousness that it means more than it says. And this consciousness is sometimes revealed just through a single word, suggesting the beauty of a very familiar object that you and I see. Just listen to what William Wordsworth says. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. Or you can be fascinated by what Lord Byron describes the perfect beauty of a young girl. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry night, and all that is best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Or another example from Tennyson, we find the beautiful message in the babbling of the brook. For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. And this consciousness gives a new explanation of the common phenomenon that you and I see in a very short and succinct way. I'll give another example from Francis Thompson. He just cryptically says in a single word, revealing the beauty, and death is birth. Or you have heard of Lear saying, you do me wrong to take me out of the grave. Or the pathetic expression of Gloucester in King Lear, when his eyes were gouged and with a bleeding socket, he realizes his gross mistake of trusting his bastard son Edmund. And he had driven away and almost ruined his legal son Edgar. And realizing, you know what he says very beautifully? I stumbled when I saw. Now you understand from these examples that how the consciousness is revealed in the form of lovely, beautiful things from single expressions from English poetry. Sometimes, as I said, This consciousness or awareness gives a new explanation for the common experience which we cannot but admit to be beautiful when Francis Thompson praises suffering. It is the falling star that trails the light. It is the breaking wave that hath the might, the passing shower that rainbows mantle. Or when we ponder over the immortal lines of Edgar in King Lear, when he did not reveal his identity to his father, when he was just walking with his injured eyes, totally without any eyes, you're just walking to commit suicide. There, in the form of poor John, he recognizes his father and then tries to encourage him when he thought of committing suicide. People can rot here when he said that. What did Edgar tell him? What? Ill thoughts again in you? Men must endure their going hence, even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. What lovely expressions. He says, or you come across in Hamlet, very beautifully, he speaks of the binary of life. In life, we have the binary of body and soul, flesh and spirit, birth and death, light and darkness, youth and age, pain and joy, wrinkles and wrinkles, winter and warm, love and lightning, virtue and vice, good and bad, boon and bathos. Can you forget the lovely description in this experience of Hamlet when he says, what a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. Paragon means head of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Look at the bathos. You praise man to the skies and then put him down like a hot potato. When he realizes that binary of boon and bathos, what fantastic expression. We are great, but at the end, we turn to dust. Great Alexander, dead and turned to clay. And great Caesar died and turned to dust. And dust is dirt, and dirt becomes clay to patch up a hole in the wall to pluck the winter's flaw. That is the end of man. What a beautiful way Hamlet describes the binary of our life. Is it not so beautiful to educate us, friends? And you and I have seen, for example, very often the rainbow in the sky. How many times you have seen and experienced? It has not sensitized us in any way. It doesn't sensitize most of us. We miss the awareness, the consciousness which William Wordsworth had. When he saw it, he expressed his intimate relationship and kinship with nature. He was overjoyed and said, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." So it was when my life began, and so it is it now I am a man, and so be it when I grow old, or let me die. The child is the father of the man, and I could wish my days bound each to each by natural piety. Look at the devotion to nature. So divine relationship with nature by this wonderful expression of just looking at the rainbow. Again, friends, you must have heard of G.K. Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was a Jesuit priest and poet. When he saw early morning a falcon soaring in the sky in a turbulent, windy morning, he bursts out his consciousness and awareness. My heart in hiding, stirred for a bird. He calls it the wind over because it hovers over the wind. It was able to keep the balance so beautifully. Why? Because of his inventive expression. It has that inscape, the individuality, the idiosyncrasy, the pattern and design put in that bird by God. And it can keep the balance and take a U-turn without any difficulty. And that inscape is supported by, sustained by that in stress which he uses the word. That is the sprung rhythm with which he uses in that lovely poem, The Wind Over. And he says, it is soaring so high. But you know how he begins the poem? I caught this morning, morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn drawn. It is not flying. He says, falcon in his riding, the achieve of, the mastery of, the mystery of the thing. It doesn't stop being a priest. He slips after observing the beautiful balancing act of the bird, which he discovered. He immediately slips into a meditative mood of the beauty of Christ's suffering on the cross. Now, Christ was represented in the medieval period as a man riding on a horse at night. Therefore, he links by saying, "Oh, my chevalier," and then slips into the meditation of Christ's passion. And he calls it brute beauty. It may be a contradiction term, but it is not so. Christ's suffering on the cross and death for the sinful humanity is beautiful, amazingly beautiful. But at the cost of what? An excruciating death, ignominious death on the cross. That's why he calls it brute beauty, valor and act, pride and plume. And then it says it is not only beautiful, a billion times told lovelier and more dangerous, because cash, gold, vermilion of his precious blood. So just imagine for the common experience how these great minds are able to convey to you and me that awareness which most of us miss. And that is poetry. And then, while talking about the spiritual sterility, depravity, aridity of modern man, T.S. Eliot says, we are all hollow men, We are the stuffed men leaning together, headpiece. And then we are, alas, our tried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cell. We are shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, and gesture without motion. What else you can see? The remarkable way which T.S. Eliot says. Again, he says towards the end of the poem, The Hollow Man, the eyes are not here. There are no eyes in this valley of dying stars, in this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. I will go back again to what Shakespeare says. In spite of all the difficulties that you and I face, he speaks so beautifully in the character of Hamlet. There is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. We defy augury. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be not, if it not be now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. I mentioned earlier in King Lear what Edgar says to his father. The ripeness is all. Here uses the word, the readiness is all. In life, we have to be not raw or rotten fruits, but ripened and mellow fruits. And we should be always ready to press the exit button from this world. That is the feeling uppermost in the mind of Shakespeare. Just a few simple expressions. Ripeness is all. Readiness is all. And in another occasion, he says, perfection is all. Whatever we do it perfectly. If we follow these three statements, our life becomes really glorious on this earth. Let me not miss the 20th century W.B. Yeats. He speaks so beautifully of his experience of the total disintegration of the society in the West owing to the World War. You know what he says? All of you know very well. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. What a remarkable statement. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Speaking such words in his ripe old age with all wisdom, people don't accept. Like Rabbi Ben Ezra, who said, youth shows by half, grow old along with me, the best is yet to come. Similarly, William Butler Yeats says it in the famous poem Sailing to Byzantium. That is no country for old man. This Ireland is not for old man. An old man is a tattered coat upon a stick. The youth in one another's arms, birds in the trees. These dying generations, at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish flesh or fowl, commend all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born, and dies, caught in the sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. By these samples, I am sure you and I recognize so beautifully what Longinus calls the echo of great soul. This perception which poetry gives of the hidden beauty of the commonest things is perhaps the best benefit of education, because it is an elementary satisfaction of our human soul's appetite for the infinite beauty. That is why St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And that is reflected by George Herbert in his famous poem Pulli, or the Gifts of God. Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. I have dealt at length about the consciousness, the awareness of the common experience, how poetry can communicate so elegantly. The next element that comes upon in poetry is the suddenness of the revelation and the restraint with which it expresses. When I speak of restraint, reticence in a controlled way, we who are usually prone to say more than we feel are shocked to discover in the poem Idylls of the King, where Tennyson has no more to say of the heart-breaking grief of Elaine's family on her sad death in simple, restrained manner. So that day there was dole in Astolet. And we have a beautiful example from Macbeth. Macduff in the play, Macbeth, on hearing the monstrous Macbeth has killed all his pretty chickens and the dame, meaning his wife and children, does not grow hysterical, but simply says with reticence and restraint, he has no children. Similarly, Wordsworth has nothing more pathetic to say of Michael's grief at the loss of his son. He was a very robust peasant, Michael, but when he lost his son, the grief gripped him so much, and William Wordsworth expresses it with restraint and reticence. From that day, he never lifted a single stone. And again, when Edgar revealed his identity towards the end, when he had the dual battle with Edmund and killed him, it is at that time he reveals his identity to his father, Gloucester, in King Lear. And Gloucester, when he heard and came to know about the identity of Edgar, the emotional shock almost killed the old man. You know how Shakespeare puts it? His flawed heart burst smilingly. His flawed heart, alack, too weak the conflict to support, betwixt two extremes of passion, joy and grief, burst smilingly. This is the lesson of restrained, and reticence. The most beautiful things that great poetry teaches us. Thirdly, we can even draw ever-growing pleasure from the rhythm, meter, melody, harmony, rhyme that go to make up poetry. In the beginning, I gave two examples of a man climbing a tree and was stung by a bee, being asked, "Does it buzz?" He answered, "So it does." And then the boy speaking to the girl, "Oh dear, come near, why fear? I'm here, bring the bottle of beer, we'll break for cheer." I said, it has no soul at all, just a meter and melody. But when you read Hudson has an observation to make. Some great poetry has the garb of meter, the sounding pattern, the alliterations, the assonance, particularly in G.M. Hopkins' poems, that gives you real charm and beauty. You know what he says, Hudson? The beauty of the rhythm is the first and easiest of all the beauties of poetry to appeal to us. They are like dewdrops, which appear like jewels and pearls on the grass. It is no ornament or accessory, but vital product of the very spirit of poetry or the soul of poetry. I will give some examples. Are we not easily carried away by the rhythm in Milton's poem L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, the happy man and the pensive man? I will just quote a few lines from the L'Allegro, the Italian titled poem, The Happy Man. Quips and cranks and wanton wiles, knots and becks and wreathed smiles. Come and trip it as you go on the light fantastic toe. What lovely rhyming words, which gives charm to the spirit of poetry. Again, are you not so much impressed by the natural rhythm coinciding with the metrical rhythm in Milton's lovely description of the fall of Satan from heaven to hell? There was battle in heaven, and the disobedient Satan was defeated. And God, as Milton says, hurled him to hell with all his followers, and they became dark and disfigured. While describing the fall of Satan, look at the sound pattern, the meter, the melody, the assonance, the harmony with which he expresses the fall of Satan from high above to hell. From morn to noon he fell, noon to dewy eve, a summer's day. A summer's day is always very long in Europe. From morn to noon he fell, noon to dewy eve, a summer's day, and with the setting sun dropped from the zenith like a falling star on Lemnos, the Aegean Isle. One of the most, this is the beautiful example to prove that even meter, rhythm, and rhyme can teach us. Another most important sources of melody in poetry is the skillful repetition. Sometimes the repetition may be a single word, like for example, wild or little or never. When you take out these words from the context of poetry in which it is incorporated, it may mean nothing. But look at a single word the repetition of it can give us immense message. It almost unlocks, unpacks, and unleashes a treasure, as for example, in Francis Thompson's poem Daisy. A berry red, a guileless look, a still word, strings of sand, and yet they made my wild, wild heart fly down to her little hand. What a beautiful way Francis Thompson says. Or in Shakespeare's Richard II, a little grave, a little grave. Or Lear's last words, the most moving scene in King Lear, when Lear is not able to bear the loss of his lovely daughter Cordelia. He sees that she's dead. He's not able to digest that. He carries her and says, why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou wilt come no more, never, 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 never. 6 times he uses the word never repeatedly. But the word never in that context has a mountainous meaning which moves the heart of people. In addition to the rhythm, melody, and harmony in poetry, we are sometimes carried away by the beauty and charm of expression in single line that defies all analysis. For example, not only single word, but single line. All of us are familiar with the beautiful saying of Keats, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Or William Wordsworth's, the still, sad music of humanity. Or Shelley's, our sweetest songs are those that tell us of saddest thoughts. Or to the west wind, he says, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Or Prospero saying to Ariel in the Tempest, the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. When we hear these, we come to know of Browning's musician. Out of 3 sounds, they frame not a fourth, but a star. And they continue to haunt our memory like a charm all through our life. Let me conclude, friends, by saying that great poetry educates us to look at life with the poet's insight and power of comprehension, because it strengthens our vision and sympathies and develops within us the inherent faculty of poetic interpretation. The study of poetry, I'll come back of what Matthew Arnold says, gives us consolation and stay in life. That is the objective of learning literature. In the words of Carlyle, it gives us the gift to discern the godlike mysteries of God's universe. It awakens our mind's attention to the lethargy of custom and directs it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. Thank you so much for extending your lovely participation and comprehensive listening. Welcome. We'll meet you tomorrow. Yes.
We thank our resource person, Dr. Professor A. John Siloy, for such a wonderful, enlightening session. We are delighted to see that you have enjoyed and enriched your knowledge today. There are a few announcements to be made. The feedback link will be posted in the live chat on the last day of the webinar. We will be live on YouTube at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Have a nice day.